Well, welcome. Welcome to a discussion with Chicago Covenants. I'm Ellen Keith. I'm the current Chicago Collections Board Chair, and I'm also the Director of Research and Access and Chief Librarian at the Chicago History Museum. I'm really excited to be here with Maura Fennelly and Ladale Winland, and we will talk to you tonight about the Chicago Covenants Project. We're going to first begin with our land acknowledgement. So next slide, please, Jessica. Chicago Collections Consortium acknowledges and is grateful for, excuse me, my screen is challenging, so I'm going to look at paper too. Grateful for the native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago's outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples that reside in the Chicagoland region, as well as their ancestors. Next slide, please. If you are joining us for the first time tonight, Chicago Collections is a consortium of libraries, museums, and cultural organizations all across the city. We work together for the preservation and promotion of Chicago's history and culture. We share our collections through our Explore portal, which you can see here, which provides free and open access to members' archival collections. Please check out Explore at explore.chicagocollections.org and learn more. Next slide, please. We also have an events page, so you can keep up with what's going on tonight with what we're doing. Most recent thing is our discussion tonight, but we've had some wonderful past events, and if you click on any of them, if they're held on Zoom, there'll be a link to the recordings. Next slide, please. We could not be where we are without our generous supporters who have helped us with this programming tonight. And in addition to supporting our Explore Chicago Collections portal, we are very grateful, and our executive director works tirelessly to secure these grants to provide the support. Next slide. So Chicago Covenants has its website, and there's a QR code, and we're going to be able to put something in the chat tonight as well. So please learn more about the organization after this talk tonight, and you can see where else to follow us on social media. Next slide. Oh, wonderful. Okay. Now for the main event, I'd like to welcome tonight's speakers, Maura Fennelly and Ladale Winland. Maura is the Director of Chicago Research at the Chicago Covenants and is a sociology PhD candidate at Northwestern University. Her dissertation explores the rise of homeowners associations and their impact on residential life and property relations. Before graduate school, she was an AmeriCorps Vista staff member and with the Chicago Rehab Network, an affordable housing nonprofit. She received her bachelor's degree from American University. Ladale Winland is the project director at Chicago Covenants. Ladale is a historian at Virginia Tech and one of the co-creators of Mapping Inequality on Redlining and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the author of the book Building the Ivory Tower, Universities and Metropolitan Development in the 20th Century. We're going to begin our discussion, and I'm going to turn over the driving to Ladale and Maura, who will take us through some slides, and then we've got some questions to ask, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. So thank you, Maura and Ladale.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.
Great to be here.
Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So we want to start off our conversation with the data collection process itself to give you all like a background on how this project happens, from identifying these covenants to putting them on a map that is available on our website. Many of you may be familiar with the City County building downtown, right across from the Thompson Center, which is currently undergoing renovation. But we're on the county side. Our work happens in the Recorder of Deeds. The Recorder of Deeds is home to many different really important activities and records, vital records in the county. And everything, all property transactions are kept in the Recorder of Deeds. Anything before around 1985 is also not digitized. Everything after around 1985 is available online. And so our work happens in person. So you go to the next slide, I can show you the room in which we all meet and get together. So every 2 weeks, usually on Fridays, research assistants or myself organize research sessions with volunteers. Sometimes it's first-time volunteers, but more often than not, it's returning volunteers who are coming back down and making the trip into the basement, the windowless basement of the tracks department. Within the tracks department are many of these books that you can see. These books contain all property transactions from 1800s up until the mid 1980s. There are over 3,500 of these books. So you can see these two volunteers on the left-hand side here. They're quite large books, like over 2 feet in length. They contain hundreds of pages each, and each book, they're called property index books, covers a specific section of the city, organized by something called section, township, and range. And I can go into a little more detail about that later on if people are curious about the granularities of how these books are broken up and how they relate to, the map of the county itself. So during research sessions, volunteers are, first-time volunteers are given an orientation and then are given an index book. And so during a session, you frequently work with one book at a time. Sometimes you'll get a book and half of the pages are blank, and so you'll quickly move on to a next. Another book you'll get on, and there will be over 20 covenants in one book, and you'll be working sometimes for 2 different research sessions with one at once. So within the books, right, the volunteers are going literally line by line to identify what is a potential covenant. And in a moment, I'll show you how we do that in a little more detail. But just to give you a little more background on the stages, so the volunteers do the crucial work of identifying the document numbers of the property transactions that were the creation of racial covenants. And then research assistants do other stages in terms of a process called booking and paging and requesting the documents from the recorder, which is, you can see that on the right-hand side. This is an order form. So we list out the document number, its respective book and page, and then we retrieve those documents to get the actual covenant document itself in hand. The information is inputted online in Virginia Tech, and then it's put online onto our online map. And if we go to the next page, I can show you a little more detail of what these pages look like, right? So the page here, this is what's in the index book that volunteers look through. And this image was taken by journalist Dennis Rodkin on an article covering our project. So we can see several of the indicators that we look for in these books that tell us what is a likely covenant. If you can see on the furthest left-hand side at the bottom, you can see it says AGMT. That tells us that that property instrument is an agreement. If you go a little bit further to the right, you see April 24th, 1948. That means that this agreement was created within the bounds of when racial covenants were being created and approved in Cook County. So 1948 was the last year that we see new ones, of course, right before Shelley versus Kramer in the Supreme Court. Also next to it, you may see it says race restriction. So this tells us, if a volunteer is going through a book and they see this, this will 100% be a racial covenant. Sometimes race restriction is not written down in the book, which I think is an interesting idiosyncrasy as to why sometimes it said race restriction or not. But this is just an example of the process that our volunteers go through in terms of identifying, how we get the data for our project. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so what do we do with this information? We are uploading a map throughout the project, so through our data collection. This is an image of Cook County, of covenants that we have currently mapped. This is not all of the covenants we have found. To date, we have located over 1,471 racial covenants. 515 are currently mapped. So we have many more to map that are mapped. So this map will be much more full in time. And if we go to the next slide, I can show you, through passage of time, right? So there's a timeline on the bottom. This shows the map with, again, just the covenants mapped so far. We can, we visualize with real time over the timeline on the bottom where they're appearing. One thing I want to note, and we can maybe talk about this in the discussion, the purple on here, those are called plat restrictions. Those were created by developers creating new subdivisions where nobody was living quite yet, and they decided that they wanted to make the area white only. So those are purple. You can see they're in more ex-urban areas, were not as densely populated. The red covenants, that is what our project is doing, is identifying these petition agreements created by neighbors in an already occupied residential area. It's the red, I like to, it's the example of group action against other groups being there is what is represented on that map. We can go to the next slide. And here's just another zoomed in example. So this is a little more zoomed in on the south side. And again, just to clarify, other covenants we have found are not on this map yet. So for example, Hyde Park, there are covenants we have found there that cover much more of Hyde Park, but are just not here at present. And we can go to the next slide as well. This is just an example, just to show the variation in the size of these covenants. So you may have seen the other one, they're really small covenants, just a block or two. This is a tremendously large covenant on the near north side, covering, right, you can see Division to the north, Wells to the west, Lakeshore Drive or the lake to the east, and the river on the south. So covering a really substantial amount of land. And so, there's variation in the power of restriction across these different covenants, which I think is interesting and something that definitely I think deserves more attention. And also just to point out, like variation of where these covenants existed, right? Near north side is today, more affluent area, but other neighborhoods I just shown on the map are in majority African-American neighborhoods today and middle income working class neighborhoods. And so again, there's variation in the location of these covenants. And we can go to the next slide. Sorry. Okay, this is the last. So I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but the question is, well, what did covenants do? Why do they matter? They restricted where people in Chicago specifically, where African Americans had access to housing. And it perpetuated segregation along racial lines and led to an immense unequal distribution of resources. And we see the ramifications of that still today. In different cities throughout the United States, there was discrimination against many other non-white individuals and racialized groups. So different Asian communities, Jewish people, Latino people discriminated from areas throughout the United States. In Chicago, it is primarily discrimination against African Americans, which is associated with the Great Migration. So just really briefly, 1930 map on the left shows the Black Belt, which is the area of the city where African Americans had access to housing. So where they were actually able to live, that covenants did not actively prevent them from residing in. People were in, double, tripled up housing. There was lots of vermin, unsanitary conditions, and the rental housing that they were living in frequently was, not on, they weren't equitable leases, and people didn't have great rights as when residing. And then just to show, change over time in terms of 1960, the darker shaded area is percentage African American today. To show, right, this is from 30 to 60, we of course have immense amounts of white flight, suburbanization, just to show change over time, which I think it's interesting to compare to the map I showed earlier, where we have our timeline where you can see, where these covenants popped up over time, and then further later on throughout the 20th century. Yeah. Thank you. So those are all the slides I have. And so I don't know if Ladale, you want to add anything, or we can open up to our conversation.
I think we can go ahead into the discussion.
Thank you. Before we turn to, we already have a live question based on something Maura said, so I'll ask it. Are these 1,000 plus covenants for individual properties only, or any of them groups of properties?
So that's a really great question. They're groups of properties. These are groups of property owners coming together to sign them. And that's a really interesting thing that our volunteers see when identifying. It was cut off on that image that I showed of the chart, but the grantor for these documents, so right, the person or the institution issuing the transaction or the document type, it always says someone's name and then et al. Because it's a group of people, it's a neighborhood of people coming together. So that's a really great question.
We've got another question. There is discrimination in Chicago against Latinos for where they could rent. I think this was more informal and not in covenants. Were there any racially restrictive covenants against groups that were other than Black in Chicago?
It's a great question. We have not seen in the documents themselves discrimination against Latino people, but of course, as the person says, that does not mean discrimination was happening in other forms, right? Rogers Park, for example, we know there's lots of discrimination against Jewish people. We haven't seen so far Jewish people banned in racial covenants in our Rogers Park property books. It very likely was just happening in more informal means against, through realtors doing steering and things like that.
Our audience just has great questions. I've got another great question. Were Native Americans ever included in these covenants?
That's a really good, not that I've seen. Liddell, do you?
Not in Metro Chicago. I should say the peripheral kind of plat restrictions, the phrasing is usually none other than the Caucasian race. And so that's kind of like a catch-all exclusionary. So in many cases, like Jews were excluded and Native Americans might also be under that kind of terminology and definition. But in Cook County, we have not seen specific exclusion for Native Americans or for Jews in covenants. And I should say yet. We're about 25% of the way through the county, kind of about almost 50% of the way through the city. And one of the reasons we're interested in doing the entire county and the entire city is that you can get an idea of how these worked with a handful of covenants, but like until you find every document, like you can't do justice to the differences of each neighborhood, of each real estate developer or broker, or to the kind of patterns or examples of like resistance and opposition.
Sorry, I just have a quick comment for Liddell. Is there any way you can get your volume up a little more?
I could try. How's that?
Thank you. I've got another question. When you're finished with this work, what happens? When are you going to finish this?
Well, so it's a long-term multi-year project. So for 25% of the way through the county, it's plausible that at our current pace, in about 2 years, we could be just about done with the county. But that depends, right? As we've been at kind of increasing pace over time because we grow more effective in our methods and ever more volunteers contribute more and get more effective. And so we kind of have been increasing our pace. For what are the end products? I'll say, I mean, for specific products, we would like a comprehensive map of every covenant in Cook County. We're also developing a digital archive where people will be able to access these. But we take inspiration from some other civically engaged projects where the process is the product. We have so many volunteers who come in and tell us about their neighborhoods, who bring us their kind of local knowledge, who learn from us and each other, and I think become ever more sensitive and ever more interested in the way that racial segregation shaped and continues to shape Metro Chicago, that those kinds of conversations with volunteers, those kinds of presentations to the public are key parts of that. They're key products of the process. And so we don't want to say like a publication or a map is enough. Really, it's about kind of helping Metro Chicagoans reflect, I think, more intensely and more actively on this legacy of segregation and inequality, and think about how we can remedy that in the present and in the future.
That leads into the next question I see asked is, this is an interesting project on a lot of different levels. The volunteer base, has it been reliable? Do you have confidence in the process? If so, what's your secret to making volunteerism work?
I would take it.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So I started as a volunteer with the project. So I was in my second year of graduate school, and I wanted to do something that did not involve me staring at a computer. And so I joined the project, and clearly I couldn't get enough of it. But we do have a very sustained volunteer base. Like I said, every 2 weeks we have these sessions. And I would say we average around six to 10 people per session. And once volunteers have come, at least 2 times and feel comfortable with the process, we have many who go on their own time. So the tracks, one really neat benefit of, being a public building is that it's open and it's free to the public 9 to 5 p.m. So people do come down, who may work downtown and take an hour on their lunch break and put in a podcast and cruise through a book, right? Because once you really get through the awkwardness of reading really old cursive handwriting, right? It's kind of like a relaxing activity. And so, yeah, it is great. And then during the actual sessions themselves, like as Ladale was saying, is like, I learn a lot from people especially people who are from Chicago and from the area. I'm not from the city, but I've learned people share stories about, their neighborhoods growing up and experiences that, family members may have had in terms of housing searches or just stories over time. So that, I think, is a really neat part of it, is that volunteers, we all get to talk with one another and talk about, thinking about what these covenants did. And also, unfortunately, but it is the reality of Chicago is one of the most segregated, and the Chicago Metro, one of the most segregated areas in the United States. And, we have those conversations together, which I think is important, and it's rare to have that. So I think that is a big benefit of the project.
Another question. So a group of homeowners sign a covenant. How long does it hold legal effect?
It typically runs for 20, 21, sometimes as long as about 25 years. It usually says on the document, and the standard is about 20 to just over 20 years. And then it expires because that kind of legal restriction or covenant cannot go on in perpetuity. But what we often see is that when a covenant was created in the 1920s, in the mid 1940s, the same area refiles another covenant. And so that it doesn't run in perpetuity, but that kind of neighborhood impetus, in large part shaped by like real estate interests, kind of keep driving people, or did keep driving people to renew the covenants.
And okay, so everyone has such great questions. They all follow all each other. So I think I heard Maura say that covenants ended or were outlawed in 1948. Is that right? Did the practice persist regardless?
Yes. Yeah. So they could not be constitutionally enforced. That's what Shelley versus Creamer. That did not make them go away. It was not until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act that discrimination on the basis of race was deemed illegal. So there was a 20-year period where realtors and white homeowners were still using these covenants as tools of exclusion. And again, likely as research has shown, like steering and other forms of discrimination in housing also continue right through present day. But 48 was by no means the end of these covenants having power. Just more so in terms of like our data collection, right? We don't see new ones in the books. Yeah.
So we've talked about Cook County. Another question is, did any surrounding counties have covenants?
Oh, yes. I'll say I'm part of a national coalition of covenants researchers, people at the University of Washington, University of Minnesota, University of Michigan, in Washington, D.C., like all around the country, even in rural areas. And every state in the union had covenants. And I would go so far as to say that every community in the country that was settled more than about 2,000 or 3,000 people probably had racially restrictive covenants by the mid 1940s. That's how widespread they were. In part because of the influence of the real estate industry, which basically set this all out. What that means for Metro Chicago, we've done some preliminary research in Lake County, as well as in Will County, and have found covenants as well. And so that national pattern exists in Chicago as well. I'm sure every metro county, but probably with like slightly different patterns, slightly different intentions for exclusion and for the execution.
So our next question, Martin Luther King was in Chicago in 1966 to shine a light on housing disparity. What was the effect of his being in Chicago on local efforts?
So not as effective as I think they had hoped. Like the scholarship is essentially that the elder Mayor Daley sort of like agreed with his demands, but did not like pursue strong enforcement. However, that effort and that recognition, like starting from the 1940s, but intensified in King's Freedom North movement, helped energize African-American communities in cities like Chicago. And so at about the same time, you have, for example, like the Woodlawn organization, with like renowned activism and working against housing discrimination, as well as other kind of consequences, especially in the schools. And so I would not either like attribute all credit to King or say that it was a failure because it didn't quite achieve the goals that he wanted, but it was part of a broader shift in African-American activism to take on housing segregation.
Our next question is a great note. This is from Susan Schwartz. My husband and his father, Charles P. Schwartz Sr. and Jr., made the lawsuit that broke the covenants in Hyde Park, Kenwood. Also, since I'm old, I can tell you which were the Jewish buildings on the near north side. Another question.
Let me say, thank you to your predecessor for their service. Excellent work.
Definitely. Another question. Are you connecting with Tanika Lewis in your folded map project?
I'm familiar with the folded map project. And I don't know if we've connected yet, but I think it also the folded map project is, I think, a great example of ongoing projects that are related to the work that we're doing, right? The folded map project is like right present day. People aren't familiar. It's like if you take I wish I hadn't like, something on North Damon Ave compared to South Damon Ave, and people who live in those neighborhoods or who live in the addresses of North and South, 600 North compared to 600 South, meet and, talk about the history of segregation and racism in the city. I think is related to this, right? In terms of showing the impacts of segregation over time and, also, public facing and things like that.
We've had interest from like a wide array of journalists as well as other kind of Chicago area artists. And so we just want to be a resource for anyone who's interested in that kind of place-based reflection or that kind of outreach. And we'll say, as a historian and a sociologist, like we've got some ideas about how this can be used. and everybody in the public has like way more and way better ideas. And so we'll make our materials available and all of our knowledge available to anybody who's interested.
Excellent. Another question about volunteers. Can you share anything about the demographics of the people who volunteer, ratios of men, women, Black, white, younger, older, etc.?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. It is definitely a really diverse group of people in terms of age, race, ethnicity, um, occupation. Um, I think there even is there's a quite a number of people who come in from the suburbs as well. So it's not just Chicago, people who live close to downtown. A few of our volunteers are up in Rogers Park, like I said, others in the suburbs. And there's also a lot of college students who join. So right, there's research assistants who do amazing work with social media and organizing the sessions as well, and data management. But there's also just college students who may take a class and are interested to get engaged. So it really, I think, is a really great mix of people who have been part of the project.
That's great to hear. And another question is covenant language fairly standard or widely divergent?
Yeah, very standard. Nadia might go a little more detail into this, but it's basically boilerplate language. So the covenant documents that we do, and you can see examples of this on our website. If you go to the map, many of the covenants, if you click on them, will have a link to the actual covenant document. You can see it's really boilerplate, legalized writing, right? That, this covenant runs with the land. It has it constitutes the percentage of what is someone being African American in terms of their ancestry. It has the expiration dates, etc. And the covenants form that was created here in Chicago. Nathan McChesney with the Chicago Plan Commission helped or created that, and that model covenant was spread throughout the United States. So Chicago is really central in terms of the center of real estate and the spreading of the literal form that was used.
Which is a good segue into the next question. What role did realtors play in forming neighborhood organizations, and how did they bring owners together? Was their pressure explicit and even threatening?
So I'll say the real estate industry was key and probably like the central player in the spread of covenants from, first of all, Nathan McChesney, in his many roles in Chicago. He was the general counsel for the National Association of Real Estate Boards. And so there was a 1926 Supreme Court decision about a covenant in Washington, D.C. that basically said, we're not going to rule these. We don't even have jurisdiction to talk about racially restrictive covenants. And after that, he took that document as a model and basically created like a mass distributed form. And so what we see is that language that he created in these like mass printed forms sent out to neighborhood improvement associations or restriction associations. And in many cases, these are led by people who were like real estate brokers or real estate developers. Some scholarship from like the 1940s estimates there were as many as 300 of these restriction and improvement associations active in Chicago. So we can't say how every single one worked, but we see the same patterns again and again, like the leaders, the directors of these organizations were real estate lawyers, real estate brokers, and so forth. And they marshaled kind of a generally willing neighborhood groups. But in a couple of instances, like the Woodlawn covenant that was ruled unconstitutional or non-functional in Hansberry versus Lee, there was actually like fraud, or people were misled about what they were signing. And so the individual signers in many cases are like not the central players. It's the people who are organizing, who are printing this up, and who are like basically leading the charge for covenants.
Another question, I suspect this kind of thing still happens even though illegal. Do you see any actual evidence of this?
In present day real estate practice? Well, Mara, maybe you want to handle it.
I was gonna say, so yeah, so there's not the instances of the racial covenants still do exist on people's individual deeds, but they cannot be enforced. And so you don't see de jure discrimination on the basis of race like since 1968. However, I think as we've mentioned, there's much more de facto and informal mechanisms of discrimination throughout housing in many different ways, which we can go more into if people want, but we can see it in it's in different stages of the process. Like I said, steering still does happen where people are certain groups are steered towards certain neighborhoods and steered away from others. And there's also, of course, lots of research on how homes are valued, right? So the basis of restrictions is to protect property values, both of the present and in the future. And that's based in the racist idea that non-white people devalued property. And there's lots of research still today on appraisal gaps, how homes are valued through today that is connected to the racial covenants.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'll add that in the 1940s, when the NAACP was gearing up with their legal strategy to attack covenants as well as several other forms of racial segregation, there was a major conference in Chicago. And Robert Weaver, who was working in Chicago at the time, he was later the first Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He said, like, listen, gang, like we should take on covenants and try to get them ruled unenforceable or unconstitutional, but we should not pretend that this will solve the problem. This is one part of the problem, and then we're going to need to turn to another, which would be things like what he called gentlemen's agreements, that kind of like steering into particular neighborhoods or exclusionary steering. And I think the planning profession has brought up the idea of like exclusionary zoning, minimum lot sizes, and things like this, which are race neutral, but have an overwhelmingly like racially exclusionary set of effects.
Another question, have things like homeowners associations taken the place of things like restrictive covenants?
So I think that I could talk for too long about this, but so I think that I'll be short. So I think there is research that shows on average, homeowners associations, the residents who live there are more likely to be white and Asian compared to African American and Latino. However, homeowners associations are booming in number. Like last year in 2023, 85% of new single family homes built are in HOAs. So I say that just to say, like, HOAs are very, very diverse, and they are much different than I think than their origin, right? They were initially created as places to, again, maintain property values. And so oftentimes, historically, in origin were white only spaces and such. But I think today there's much more variation in how they exist, who lives there and their purposes. But I think they do all have, right, these covenants, conditions, and restrictions that do have rules on what people can and can't do. But the impacts of that, I think, are more complicated than the history of racial covenants specifically.
And you referenced the Hansberry case. Can you talk a little bit more about the involvement of the Hansberry family?
Sure. So
oh, and Liddell, would you, if you don't mind, with your mic again?
Yep.
Thanks.
Is that better? Great. So the Hansberry family, like you probably know or have heard of Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, in part informed by her experiences as a child. Her father was a real estate investor, businessman, and he often led or kind of executed conversions of apartment houses to kitchenettes as one of the ways of creating units or increasing the number of units in places like the Black Belt. But he and a couple of colleagues involved in an insurance company called Supreme Liberty Life were interested. They were like integrationists, and they said, like, why, like, when we've got the resources, we've got the money, why shouldn't we be able to live in any neighborhood that we can afford? And so Hansberry and Harry Pace, who is a Supreme Liberty executive, each kind of developed a test case, or they moved into houses that had covenants on them in 1937 with the idea that they would have to like defend themselves or attack the covenants. And so they did this kind of in concert with a couple of real prominent Chicago lawyers, Earl Dickerson and Truman Gibson. And so they fought it and lost and lost and lost all the way to the US Supreme Court, where they won over that one individual covenant. And the Supreme Court said, because of that fraud in the creation of the covenant, we don't even need to rule on the fundamental constitutionality of covenants, because we can just say this one covenant is like, it was illegally created. And so fundamental constitutional issues, we're going to leave that for another day. That covenant is no longer operative, and it opened up most of Woodlawn. I think like 500 homes had signed that covenant in 1940, opened it up to African-American residents or ownership.
Thank you. Another question, you've discussed the role of realtors in that industry. And what about the role of banks and mortgage loan organizations, et cetera, the financing of home ownership?
So I'll say that they are somewhat less explicitly involved. However, they're part of kind of a broad coalition that emerges in the 1920s, 1930s, and then sort of coalesces in the 1940s. And in part, like there is a researcher, an economist at Northwestern University named Richard Ely, who basically worked with the real estate industry. He worked with other economists, and he worked with financiers, and he helped develop public policy that was implemented both in professional practice and was incorporated into policies in the Hoover administration and the Roosevelt administration in the Depression, when they kind of restructured home finance and real estate development. And so, like, it was at that point that individual kind of prejudice or individual individual action was kind of built into a restructured system of home finance that had as its fundamental idea that Maura had made reference to, which was that the mixing of races or the introduction of minorities made property less valuable, right? Like that had been an individual idea, and then it was fundamental after the 1930s to real estate practice, to investment practice, and it was in the textbooks that were in like college classes. And so that was part of the process. Even though it's kind of like the real estate professionals who are really at the front lines of this, they're kind of marching as part of a broader group.
Thank you. Gosh, we've had some fabulous questions from the audience. I'm going to turn now, but people are welcome to keep submitting them. I'm going to turn now to some of the ones that we were intending to ask, and we'll see what time we have time for. How did you get started? How did this project get started?
I got a fellowship at the Newbury Library in 2021, and just about the same time, I got a message from Natalie Moore, then a WBEZ journalist, saying, "Hey, what do you know about covenants?" Because we had talked about redlining and the Homeowners Loan Corporation up to that point, and she was working with a national NPR journalist on a series of stories in a couple of communities around the country. And I thought, like that's something I've had an interest in. Um, and if like a journalist like Natalie Moore is interested, like maybe this has legs. And so we got together in the spring of 2021, kind of just figuring out how this worked in the tracks department of the county clerk's office. And then kind of after that spring, I recruited a couple of people to kind of turn this into an official, like a project, that it wasn't just like a couple of people like just trying to page through a couple of books, that we had a process and a method for recording the data and so forth. And so it was kind of fall of 2021 that this became much more regular, with some interruptions for kind of continuing lockdown or closures and so forth. And then in kind of summer of 2022 was when Maura got involved and had come to a couple of sessions. And then Maura, why don't you talk a little bit about what your journey has been?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I briefly mentioned during the PowerPoint part, I was in the midst of trying to finish up my master's thesis portion of the graduate school before the dissertation, and I have been long interested in housing and all that, and I had no archival experience or anything, and I saw the Covenants Project first on Twitter, back when I was on Twitter quite too much, but I was on Twitter, and I joined the project. And Ben Miller was one of the lead RAs, and Ben Miller has been crucial part of the project. He is actually about to start a PhD in history at Northwestern, and he showed me the ropes of how everything happens, and I was like overwhelmed by all of the information that existed in the basement of the tracks department, and it was, wonderful and exciting, and it was really neat. And went down almost every 2 weeks to join the project, and then I was interested in getting more involved in terms of uh, helping facilitate the process happening, right? So, even though the research process itself of going through these books is, we know how it works now, and we have an orientation, and we know what to look for and weird idiosyncrasies that pop up. But it's a ton of work, right? From knowing what books we've done to collecting all of the information that volunteers have found, and then identifying these covenants. And so it was exciting to join in on that project, on that process. Yeah.
I'll say briefly that one of the things that makes Chicago kind of special, as Maura noted, is that it's the center of the real estate industry. One of the things that makes it difficult is that this is all analog. And so while there are research projects around the country, they're almost all like fully digital. They like go to the recorder of deeds or their clerk, and they negotiate and say, great, just give us the digital images. And that's not possible in Cook County. So like that makes it kind of challenging. It also makes it kind of challenging that I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I make my living in Virginia, even though I come back for research to Chicago regularly. That's what makes it difficult. That's what also I think makes it valuable. Like if it was easy, anybody would have done it by now. but having Maura involved is like essential. Someone who's like on the ground and like is familiar to people, and she's like such an awesome like administrator and such a great participant that the origins are a little bit um, wacky to have someone kind of conducting this remotely, but one of the highest priorities is kind of coordinating with the on the ground, having FaceTime with the volunteers, sort of makes it both rewarding and possible.
Mhm. We have another question from the audience. Have you applied for or received grants for the project?
Yeah, and any kind of project like this like requires pretty significant funding, and so we're very fortunate that we're now, I don't know, maybe a third of the way through a 2-year grant from the National Historic Publications and Record Commission, which is kind of administered by NARA. But then we're also aided by a number of like kind of smaller grants from Virginia Tech, which like basically just allows us to like pay the access fees and to like pay the research team. And like it's an almost nonstop process of fundraising. I took like 2 months off and I was like, okay, I'm not going to do any grants for a little while so I can work in my book. And then I was like, oh no, but seriously, I got to get back on the grants. So, like going to open up a Google Doc probably next week for the next to kind of think about funding beyond 2025 if necessary.
So another question, and I think I'm not going to phrase this right, so bear with me. These are all questions we thought of before we talked to you all, and so I have so many ideas going on after this wonderful conversation. What impact does racial covenants have on maintaining spatial and racial inequality in Chicago? I mean, I know there's there's the Black Belt, and there's the people being in more sort of tenement housings where the housing isn't great, but what in if you had percentages of things, what percentage do restrictive covenants play in Chicago's history of segregation?
Maura, let me take a stab, and then you can kind of add on to that. I'll say, first of all, I've done previous work on redlining, and that's in one of the ways that I kind of came to covenants. And in none of these, we could never say that this is the entire reason. Just like Robert Weaver said, like if we solve covenants, we're not going to solve like racial inequality or racial segregation. It'll just move us a little bit farther along that path. And so I'd say we can't be like definitive. However, two maybe like kind of data points that I often make reference to is, first of all, in something like the racial wealth gap, which is about like most recently I've seen put at about 10-1 for the median white family wealth versus median Black family wealth. So there's kind of like 200,000 median net wealth for white families, and about 20,000 median net wealth for Black families. And a large proportion of that is housing wealth. And that comes about as a result of multiple generations of exclusion and the prevention of building home equity, which could be passed on intergenerationally for things like more housing or things like education and so forth. And so that's one aspect, but only one aspect that doesn't get into so much the spatial, but also Federal Reserve researchers working with data out of Hennepin County have illustrated, Hennepin County is Minnesota, where Minneapolis is, have illustrated that real estate that had covenants on it had a 14% premium. Like basically just by having a covenant, and the exclusion that like provided, people were willing to pay more, and then kind of like intensified that home equity like building. So like those are two aspects, but I mean, there's many other spatial aspects. I have colleagues who do work on education inequalities, for example, because we divide and like fight like quite forcefully over the boundaries of school neighborhoods, for example, and like educational catchment basins. And that in many cases is related to like school boundaries and property values, which kind of comes back to like that home value. And those are just a handful, but Maura, what would you like to add? Or
Yeah, so two things. So one is I think, and Liddell mentioned this earlier, like the relationship between covenants and redlining, I think is right, just really important to understand the relation, and that exemplifies how these different tools work together, right? And like you have one type of the racial covenant created by neighbors and or developer, and then you have the redlining maps created, right, government with a public-private partnership. But right, white neighbors and homeowners wanted to avoid redlining, and in order to do so, were encouraged by the real estate industry to use racial covenants, right? So that's just, I think, an interesting interaction between the covenants and redlining, and there's way more research to learn about how these two tools of exclusion have interacted over time. Also, I think that there's a lot more to learn um, in terms of variation in neighborhoods where there were covenants and where there weren't racial covenants. Like, just because a neighborhood did not have racial covenants did not mean that neighborhood, if it was a majority white neighborhood, did not practice exclusion, right? Or was not, it was, and then ended up being an integrated space, right? There's these really, I think, interesting uh, stories to uncover through more archival work about the different outcomes of neighborhoods over time, and different townships and suburbs over time, that I think is interesting. So we talked about white flight a little bit, right? So some neighborhoods in the south and west side in Chicago, white homeowners passed went forth to gather all these petitions to install racial covenants, and then a few years later went to the suburbs, right? And so there's other neighborhoods though that had racial covenants and maintained, whiteness over time. And so I think parsing out those differences is, I think, really important. And there's so much work to still be done on understanding that variation.
In the last, maybe one more question. Sorry. Oh, excellent question. Please define the difference between covenants and redlining.
So racial covenants, we see this kind of before federal redlining. Essentially, this arises from the real estate industry. Even it goes back a little, almost like into the 19th century on a very limited basis, but it really kind of intensifies these restrictions placed upon new plats, or these agreements that are signed by members of a neighborhood saying that they will never sell to, lease to, or allow to be occupied by someone who's not Caucasian, or in many cases, like in Chicago, it says anyone who is a member of the Negro race. And those kind of are documents that are filed with real estate transactions. And that's why we can find them in the Tracts Department of the County Clerk's Office. Redlining was kind of the nationalization of those prejudices. And so the work by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s and the Federal Housing Administration from the 30s onward took those prejudices and said, it's not only you can't let African Americans or immigrants live here, it's that how do you even evaluate what a good neighborhood is or what a bad neighborhood is? In part, it has to do with the people who live there, according to these federal officials and these real estate leaders. And what neighborhoods or what houses or what homeowners are worthy of federal subsidy, like an FHA mortgage guarantee. And there were billions of dollars of federal money poured into those beliefs, those theories, and those prejudices of kind of federally facilitated redlining. And as Maura noted, one of the factors about what makes a good neighborhood or what makes a neighborhood stable was the presence of racially restrictive covenants. And we see these in the kind of redlining documents from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And so covenants kind of came first and operated somewhat independently. They're not the same, but redlining, which had the power of the federal government behind it, was built on a foundation of racial covenants.
Oh my gosh. Well, we got to 7 o'clock and I feel like we could talk all night. I'm sorry, I look like a ghost. It's because my lights are off. But this was so interesting. And I'm going to ask one really quick last question. If we want to get involved, what can we do?
Go to chicagocovenants.com, where we have a listing, our schedule for the rest of 2024. It's usually every other Friday at noon in the county clerk's office. We've got an orientation video. And we've got a flyer that I can't drop into the chat, but we'll send out via the Chicago Collections Consortium list with information and a kind of QR code that can take you to register. But if you go to the website, it's kind of the same information. Get in touch with us and we'll find a way to get you involved or to connect and support your organization's activities.
Excellent. Ladale, Maura, thank you so much. This was wonderful. This is just such an important project. So this program is recorded. So everyone who signed up is going to get a link to the recording shortly and it'll be on our website, and go to chicagocovenants.com. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.